All right, we're recording. Hey, Eric, thanks for doing
It
this
works
with me.
really well. It records really well.
Yeah, you've tested the Zoom recording.
Indeed.
Excellent.
If you want to restart, I won't interrupt you this time.
No, we don't need to restart. No, we're gonna just review some stuff you already went through from Romans, dig into a couple of questions that you just can't get to everything in your sermon, right?
Nice.
So we were talking the other week, and it came up that sometimes when Paul says "our," it's not entirely obvious what's our. And I brought up, what about our apostleship? And you were like, I'm glad you didn't bring that bring that up when I was studying. But I'm curious what you think about that. I mean, I know, like, we want to make a distinction between the 12 apostles and let me just read the passage I'm thinking of.
Yeah.
It's in Romans 1, and in his introduction, it's actually we. So in Romans 1:5, he says, through him we have received grace in our apostleship to bring about the obedience of faith among all the Gentiles on behalf of his name. And then, when you get to later in the book, as you know, you find out we is like this whole group of people that he's writing with that aren't part of the 12, or could be at least. So what do you think? Do you think so he's definitely talking about his apostleship, and there's, but do you think it might overlap with a larger call to ministry?
Yeah. So the question is, like, how big is this we, right?
Yeah.
Like, how many people would be included in this we? Would we be in the we that have an apostleship? Or, how many people are apostles? And I guess it depends on in what sense you mean the word apostle, right?
Yeah.
So there's the 12, right? And we have like the 12 apostles, which Christ chose. Judas betrays, they replace him with Matthias, and those are clearly a special 12, right?
Yeah, I think so.
And we see in Revelation 21 that the foundations of the New Jerusalem have the names of the 12 apostles on them. So there's a set 12, right? And they had to replace the bad one and get a new one. Yeah. And we see that there were specific requirements for those apostles. When they go to replace them, it had to be somebody that was witness to the resurrection and somebody that was authoritatively chosen by Christ. So they didn't pick, they cast lots, right? Because they were looking for Jesus to specifically choose that replacement person. Yeah. So those ones are clear.
Yeah. And they're I mean, I'm definitely in the camp of there was 12, and they were like the foundation, the founders of the church. And but then I look at it just in terms of the word. Like, when we talk about, when we say apostle, we always mean those 12, right? In general.
Well, and then, Paul's added, right? So we got 13. So Paul gets added, and he says, am I not an apostle, in 1 Corinthians, right? And he makes the case on the same grounds that he saw the risen Christ and was chosen directly by Jesus.
So here's a question about
up to 13 that. So far.
Well, here's a question about that. In Acts, do they say that Judas is an apostle?
Well, let's take a look at it. So
yeah, pull that up, because the reason I ask is I'm just wondering, because first of all, Judas did not see the risen Jesus, but second of all, he was not sent out with the 12 in the Great Commission, right? Because he wasn't there. So you might make an argument he was part of the original group of 12, but he actually dropped out quite dramatically before apostleship was the thing. Although you could still argue, like, there was an original sending out with the 12 and the 70 during Jesus' ministry, so you could argue that.
Well, and I think, the best way to say whether Judas was an apostle or not would be like in Luke 6,
Okay.
where it says Jesus went up on the mountain to pray all night, continued in prayer. And when he came down, he chose the 12 and named them apostles. And then there's a list. So that's in Luke 6, starting in 14. And that list does end in verse 16 with Judas, the son of James, and then Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. So he was definitely considered an apostle there.
That's Luke 6?
What's that?
What was that again? Luke 6?
Yeah, Luke 6:16. There's a list, specifically Jesus called them apostles, and then there's a list. And then there's another list in one of the other gospels of who. And so he was definitely considered an apostle there, and then, and then betrayed, and then replaced. And then the specific requirements in Acts were it had to be somebody that saw Christ and could be a witness with them of the resurrection. And then not only that, because that gives you like more than 500 options, right?
Yeah.
When you think about like 1 Corinthians 15, there's at least 500 people that saw Jesus risen from the dead. So that's a pool of possibilities. Yeah. But then the other requirement was that Christ specifically chose that person in a very clear, authoritative way. And that's why they did the casting of lots, which is, not the way we normally handle things, but that was a special situation.
Yeah.
So you got the 12.
Yeah.
And so we know we got the 12. We got their names. And then we know we have Paul. So it'd be 13, right? And we know that from like 1 Corinthians 15, 1 Corinthians 9. We know that like he's considered apostle. He kind of makes the case that he says he was like, one untimely born, that Christ appeared to him. And he makes it really clear that Jesus specifically called him. So same requirements. But then you have more. So Acts 14:14, Barnabas, also an apostle. And then you've got James. So in Galatians 1:19, he says that he met up with James and indicates he was an apostle. So that's James, not the original of the 12, but James, Jesus's brother. And so we're up to
connection. I don't even remember hearing that. So James
take a look.
Was not in the original list, but then in James he calls himself an apostle.
James is this particular James that wrote the book of James is Jesus's brother, James, not the apostle James.
Right.
But he is an apostle also. If you take a look at Galatians 1.
Oh, Galatians 1, right.
Yeah, okay, check this out. So Galatians 1:17, he says, "Nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me, but I went to Arabia." And then a little bit later, he says in verse 18, "And after 3 years, I went up to Jerusalem to visit Cephas," which is Peter, remained there for 15 days. "But I saw none of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother." And so we're up to 15.
Yeah.
15 for sure.
So have we gone through the whole list? I want to go through the whole list that you have there.
Of all, I mean, you could look it up in Luke. So back in Luke 6, and you take those 12 people, and then you add Paul, and then you add Barnabas because of Acts 14:14, and then you add James, but not one of the Jameses from before. This is James, right. Jesus' brother, who didn't believe in the beginning, right? So he couldn't have been an apostle back then. He didn't even believe. Yeah. And so you're up to 15 at least at that point. That seem to be apostles in the apostle sense of the strict definition of apostle, because you have James, James wrote scripture, Paul wrote scripture. Barnabas didn't write any scripture, but he's clearly considered in the same list with Paul. So I think you can use the word, you can use words in a strict sense, you can use it in a more loose sense. But in the strict sense, we have at least 15.
Oh, okay. So that's the end of the list, though, where it's explicit.
Yeah, I mean, you have some others that, like at the end of the book of Romans and stuff, you're like, maybe there's a few more, but there's not, an unlimited supply of them on that criteria, because they would have to have seen the risen Christ, right? And so there actually a lot of people did see the risen Christ, like more than 500. So you have a good sized pool. but it's not unlimited,
Yeah.
and it's not today.
So
That
on
would make
that,
the case.
I think in my mind, and I'm kind of a nerd, so I'm inclined to make much out of technicalities. But so in my mind, it's not a question of loose versus strict, but there are different senses of the word. So like we're talking about the like an office, right? And that seems pretty
Office.
clear that
Yep.
that's what's in view with James,
Mm-hmm.
uh, because even in Jerusalem, it's like he's not going out
Mm-hmm.
in the sense that the word apostle is meant in a lot of
Yeah, didn't leave Jerusalem, so it can't
yeah.
be a sent out in the sense that he went all over the world.
And that's because and words mean things in context, right? So it's
Mm-hmm.
pretty clear you have this office that consists of um well, originally 12, but I guess James was added. I didn't even know that.
Yeah, so you
So
got James, and you definitely have Barnabas, and you got Paul. So you got like 15, and then there's some debatable ones. But I mean, the big point would be, I think the big distinction to make, the big question would be, are there apostles in that sense today?
yeah.
In that sense, like we'll kind of unpack the word apostle and what it means, and kind of look at how in some other sense there might be apostles, but in
Yeah.
the sense of like having that kind of authority over the church,
Yeah.
the authority to speak for God in a way that the prophets spoke for God.
Hmm.
You've got a limited pool, just because both Paul and in Acts 1, there's clearly a need to see the risen Christ and be directly commissioned by him.
Hmm.
And so I guess someone could claim that today, but I think
Yeah.
that'd be pretty shady,
Very dubious. So there's definitely the office, and
Yeah,
I
let's call it the
actually,
office. I think that's a way better distinction instead of strict, and because we should have strict definitions for everything.
yeah,
Um,
one because it is used in a strict sense, but in a different sense in the first century. But before we go there, I actually have to think through that more now because I was kind of the thinking like you just got the 12, and then Judas is disqualified and you replace
mhm.
them. But it's a little more complicated than that.
Yeah, we have some definite, in the office sense, apostles
Yeah, at
other
least
than the 12.
I got to look at Barnabas because Barnabas, you could argue, like he was definitely like going out in the missionary sense of the word apostle,
Hmm.
um, which is another sense in how it's used in the first century. And one of the things I was thinking about after we said we were going to talk about this a bit was it's interesting to me. I can't remember in the scripture, maybe you can, where Paul's constantly coming up against false apostles or people who are spreading false doctrine or
Right.
people who are just discrediting his ministry, like
Hmm.
just maybe they're teaching the truth, but they're just disregarding
Harassing him.
people.
Yep.
Yeah. um and I don't think I remember him contradicting the claim of others to be apostles.
Well, he uses that kind of mocking term, super apostle, for
Right,
them and stuff like that. Yeah.
right,
So
yeah.
that might be not. I think when you hear him doing that, he cannot be meaning apostle in the office sense.
Oh, no.
For
Obviously,
those people, because he's clearly like messing with them,
no, totally,
hey, you guys are super apostles, and oh yeah, you don't have to suffer like me because you're a really big deal apostle. Like, so
totally.
that must be in the other sense.
Yeah,
Hey, on the Barnabas thing though, let me read you this passage.
yeah,
Interesting, because you're like, well, what about Barnabas? So Acts 14:14. So this is when Paul and Barnabas are in Lystra. And in verse 14, it says, but when the apostles, Barnabas and Paul, heard of it, they tore their garments. This is when they were like, oh, it's Zeus and
mhm,
Hermes, they're going to worship them. And it's just interesting. I mean, you could say, well, maybe that doesn't mean in the office sense,
well,
but it's
again,
Acts 14:14. But when the apostles, Barnabas and Paul, heard of it.
hmm,
So, maybe you could say that that's going to be in the second sense we're going to talk about, but so
yeah,
that would drop your number to 14, but it would still
yeah.
be more than 12.
It's a little complicated for sure, and it definitely like the fact that it's 14 seems to open the possibility that there could be others in the first century. Like,
Yeah, and I'm entirely open on that. If they met those qualifications
yeah,
and those kinds of things, that there could have been a few more, and there may be a few more even that you could prove from Scripture,
yeah,
or that would be close to the level of the Barnabas one.
yeah.
Um,
So I think there's value in pinning down the word usage. I was trying to think, like, why does this matter? Because I wasn't super excited about talking about it. It was kind of a curiosity when I first brought it up.
mhm.
But I think it matters in a couple of ways. One is you do have people taking the title apostle.
Yep.
I think the Sovereign Grace like church was or organization was like the head guy, I think, had the title apostle for a while. I
Hmm.
don't know if he still does. I A lot of things happened with the organization. I don't really know where they're at anymore.
Mhm.
But you know, one of the things we Christians tend to do is kind of squabble over kind of irrelevant details, and so one of the
I don't think we do enough of that anymore, though.
maybe not.
Like it seems like in the last year, when's the last time you heard Christians having a good knockdown fight over some wording or technicality? It's sad. We don't do it anymore.
I miss those days.
I'm more in the loss of it. I sent I had sent that diagram that I sent to you of the Abrahamic covenant. I sent that to Josh and David, and Josh said something like, "Man, I remember when people used to study and argue about these things, the good old days, you know?" And it's
Yeah,
like we become so distracted with so many, current cultural things going on,
yeah.
that it's like, man, if we could have a good fight about, the nature of the
You
covenants or something, that'd be great.
you got to come to the next. I'm putting together the menu for it, but the next politics and theology discussion
Will
because
we fight about a technical thing in the Bible?
well we were fighting over the biblical implications for politics. It was a little more nuanced, but
Okay.
there was
Yeah,
definitely
see, there you go.
back
I
and
just think, when you mentioned, like, we can squabble about these things, it's like I kind of long for the day when we do again.
yeah.
Like,
Also, it's interesting because we tend to have a lot of agreement among ourselves. Um,
yeah. But
maybe
you just can't get people, like, it's interesting. There was somebody had posted something about, like, pastors, what would get you more in trouble? Preaching a theological error or a political error?
hmm,
And I know exactly which one would get me more trouble.
really,
Isn't that interesting?
yeah,
I don't know. At our church, people are very theologically oriented, so you could probably get yourself in equal trouble. But
yeah.
it's interesting because when you say it, you're like, I bet it's the political trouble. So
Yeah.
anyway, sorry to take that rabbit trail.
Yeah, good rabbit trail.
So we should fight about some things in a nice
We
way,
should plan about some things for
yeah,
sure.
as
I
brothers.
I feel like when the issue of should you call somebody an apostle comes up, first
Hmm.
I think there's actually linguistic reason to not fight over that, but
Hmm.
to clarify what we talked about that
Hmm.
there were some guys in the first century
Hmm.
had that office.
Well, and the burden to clarify it would be on the person using that term.
Yeah, that's true.
Right. If you're going to go, if you're going to put on your business card that you're like apostle so and so, I would appreciate an asterisk on your business card, and on the back of it an explanation of
Yeah,
what you're not claiming,
yeah,
because
exactly.
the burden of explanation would be on the person walking around calling themselves an apostle. And traditionally, if you just think about church tradition, it's not done. Okay, so like Athanasius didn't call himself an apostle.
Yeah.
Augustine didn't call himself an apostle.
I think
Um,
Ignatius went out of his way to say, I'm not like them.
yeah,
I'm
so
not.
we have a tradition of really backing away from that. And with people that, like, you could legit call an apostle, if you were going to use apostle in the secondary sense, like, I don't know, like William Carey
Mhm.
or somebody like that. And those people did not want to call themselves apostles. So I'm a little like, I'm a little weirded out when some guy I've never heard of decides that he's an apostle and wants to use that term when, major, John Calvin didn't call himself an
Yeah.
apostle, like, I mean, I could go on and on. St. Patrick did not call himself an apostle. I mean, there's a massive list of people that didn't take that term that would qualify for that term way more than anyone you've ever heard that thought that they qualified.
That's definitely true. So there's a sense of the word. Well, we know that the word apostle comes from a Greek
You
verb.
should break that down, actually.
Yeah. So you have apostolane, which is the actually, no, I better fact check myself here really quick.
So the apo is off, right? And then
it's from. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's like sent off, right? To be sent off.
Yeah. But here, let me just make sure I'm saying it right, because I'll probably get in trouble here. That was 14:14, right? Yeah. So yeah, apostolos, sorry. Thought I was getting that wrong. So you have apostolos, which is apostle, it's the noun, and then you have apostoleo, which is the send out verb, right? And there are lots of people who are sent out, and that aren't apostles in the office sense,
right?
And I think one of the reasons Paul doesn't contest the word is that it even though it's used in the office sense, I think in the first century it's still used in the more generic sense of someone who's sent out. And in the early church, it comes to take on the meaning of just like basically a missionary, either to a church or outside of the church. And you see that in an early church document. It could be as early as the 90s, so as old as the book of Revelation potentially. And it talks about rules for churches and how to deal with apostolos, apostoloi, which is the plural, like apostles.
The care they would give and who they would support and
feed
and house and
exactly. So you had this apparently this tradition of traveling preachers, and there were rules for how to treat them and even judge them. There were rules in there for judging them. Like, hey, if they're asking for money, and I forget the exact rules, but it's like basically they better not ask for too much money, like go ahead and feed them, let them stay with you. But if they stay for too many days, they're false apostles.
That's good, because I mean there could be some lazy dudes cruising around just trying to be taken care of, and even if they aren't spreading false doctrine, maybe they're just not doing their job, and so don't feed that guy.
Yeah,
that's cool. That's really practical. I mean, even in like Philippians, you've got it being used in a secondary sense, like Philippians 2:25. I have thought it necessary to send to you Epaphroditus, my brother and fellow worker and fellow soldier, and your messenger, and minister to my need. And I think there, when it says your messenger, it's using a very similar word, at least, just something in the family there. So, Epaphroditus being somebody that was sent, kind of to and fro in the church and between churches and utilized in that way.
Yeah, it's the same word.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So that's, that's even using it in the way that you're talking about. I think that's really cool that there's, these early church documents outside the New Testament where they're like giving guidance, because that tells us that there were people being called that. Yeah. So, I mean, really the question would be a question of wisdom, if that word means something in particular in our culture, in both in and outside the church, that's pretty straightforward, like kind of all have a sense for what it is. Should you go ahead and use that term?
Right.
And if you are going to use that term, like I said, burden of proof is on the burden of defining and making it very clear what you mean is on you. And maybe it's not worth the time, because, here's the thing, like, okay, you call, somebody either wants to use the term or they want to give the term to somebody of apostle instead of missionary or, whatever, church planter or something like that. What's the reason?
Yeah, exactly.
And that's what's behind that. Like, why that term?
Yeah, exactly. Why? That's kind of where I was going when I was saying, like, the term itself might not be worth the time to argue about it. It might be
Mm-hmm.
worth asking the question you asked, which is, what do you mean by that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Maybe
and
I feel
like
bad.
what attracts you to that term?
Yeah,
Because cynical me, I would assume that one would be attracted to that term because it carries an air of authority that missionary, church planter, pastor, deacon, elder, that
right.
those don't carry. You want something a little bit kind of like using bishop. Bishop is a totally biblical term. Episkopos, it's like totally a legit term for an elder, for a pastor. They all mean the same thing.
Yeah.
But when you go around calling yourself bishop, why? Like, are you trying to distinguish yourself as a higher authority than pastor or elder?
Right.
It's not that it's not a legit term. It's a completely legit term. But in our culture, what does it mean? Well, it means something higher than a pastor. It means something, you have authority over a larger swath of, churches.
Right.
And so I just think it's worth asking, like,
Yeah.
why are you so attracted to that word?
Yeah.
It sounds cool. I mean, I like bishop. I mean,
That does sound cool.
I could go by bishop
The LDS Church.
biblically.
I think the LDS Church uses that though, probably because when they were founded,
Mhm.
people knew what it meant, and
They use apostle too, though.
well, that's true. But that's very explicitly,
Yes, it's an office term. Yeah.
yeah, an office term,
Yeah.
and they believe they're replacing the 12 apostles with
Yeah.
updated one.
Hey, it's worth mentioning kind of, I know this is kind of out of order, but Y12, it's kind of a neat artistic thing that the Lord did in having 12, just like there are 12 tribes, 12 apostles. It's just a beautiful symmetry that he had in mind there.
I learned from the Bible Project too. I don't know if you've heard this, but the 70 is also a similar thing, because the Table of Nations is either 70 or 72, depending on the source. And
that's super cool, because I always had connected it to when the 70 elders that Moses called out, and they all received the Holy Spirit. And so I connected that to the New Testament 70.
That's
or 72
connection, but that's the connection.
But there's also a Table of Nations connection.
Yeah, that's a connection with the Moses thing, is the Table of Nations. Yeah.
And what do you mean by Table of Nations?
There's like, so there was a point in time where the known world, like if you were going to list all the nations.
Oh, okay. So there were 70 nations.
Yeah.
And so you have one per. Oh, that's really cool.
Yeah. And I forget all the background behind it, but I thought that was cool too. And I got to go back and look at that, but there's actually a kind of what would you call it? Like a spiritual connection of, there's connections made with that to like the spiritual beings at certain points in the Old Testament. But I actually read the connection, so I don't want to go down that rabbit trail.
Okay, that's this whole different podcast.
But yeah, it's an interesting thing, because it's a kind of a, what do you call it, like an indication of even in creating Israel, like God's intention is to have dominion over the whole world.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
To reach the nations.
Yeah.
That's really great. And so these 70 plugins for the nations. It's really cool.
That didn't work out so well.
Hey, so kind of before we close on this whole topic, might be worth talking about that word apostle and sent, and in what sense we are sent. Yeah. Not that we're going to throw apostle on our business card, but I think there is a really worthwhile exploration there in what sense we are sent like Paul, or take part in Paul's apostolic ministry or whatever. So maybe we'll discuss that before we wrap it up.
In that sense, he could be talking about, when he says we have received apostleship, talking about him and his partners. And we mentioned in a private conversation, he's often putting himself out there and then trying to bring people into his way of life, which is the way of Jesus. Yeah, what do you think?
As I follow Christ, He used me as an example. And so, yeah, it's a good point. Is that when he's talking about his own kind of ministry and the way he views his purpose in the world,
Yeah.
he's saying, join me in that. He's not saying like, hey, check out what I do, and if you want to send money and support it, that's great, but that's all the part you have in this. You can be my fans. He's like, no, I want you to do this with me to whatever extent God has gifted you and giving you opportunities. You're
Fans are not a
sent.
community.
Yeah. What's that?
Fans are not a community.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like, he's like, come on, let's do this together. And I think that's really cool. I like this passage in John 20.
Mm-hmm.
And he's speaking of the apostles here, but I think there's definitely like a extension to us.
Mm-hmm. What verse?
So it's John 20. I think verse 21. Yeah. Jesus said to them again, peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, even so I'm sending you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think that's something we definitely partake in, is that just as the Father sent Jesus into the world, he has sent us into the world. You might think, well, I've always lived here and I don't feel sent. But
Yeah.
like, we are sent wherever we are. And a lot of times, when we think of the Great Commission going to all the world and stuff like that, we think that, okay, if I'm not going to leave and go to another country or a foreign place, then I'm not in on that. And I think that's not the case. You're sent where you are.
Right.
If you're not sent to another country, then you're sent to your own hometown.
Yeah.
And there is a sense in which we partake in Jesus's sent-ness, and perhaps Paul gives us a great example of what that sent-ness looks like, and then we need to apply that to where we are.
Yeah. And he like he said that we received the obedience of apostleship, but that's to bring about an obedience of faith, right? In all the nations. And the obedience that we're called to by the original sent ones is to walk in the footsteps of Jesus, walk in their footsteps, to learn to obey all that he commanded, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that includes all the commands of discipleship. And
Yep.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to mention that, some people call this the Great Commission in John, that just as I was saying, I'm sending you. And that passage in Romans where we started was about the Great Commission as well, and so there's a sense in which we have, we've been given the mission Jesus has started, and Paul continued, and it continues on in us. And that doesn't, if you're not called to some other country, and you might be called to some other country, I wouldn't rule that out. We are called to the place we're at, and whether that's a mom with her kids at the park, or at a school meeting, or just with the neighbor that's needy next door, or at the church family, or whatever, or a guy wherever he's at, out with his kids or at work or whatever he's doing, that Jesus has us here for a reason.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's
part in Paul's apostleship.
Yeah, exactly. Building the kingdom, the same kingdom that he started.
Yeah.
By the Spirit. So I want to be respectful of your time, but I'd love to pick up there sometime and talk about something we've talked about before, which is the embodied present community, and that shared sent-ness.
Cool. That actually would be a great transition to the next one.
Yeah.
Is that we're sent, but like the original apostles, we're not sent out alone. You see the apostles being sent by 2 by 2, and there's a neat thing with Paul and his band of friends that he ministers with. Paul is no lone ranger. He always wants to be with the people that he shared the gospel with in the past. He always wants to take people with him on mission, and we're to do that too. So yeah, let's do that next time.
Wonderful. All right. Well, thanks everyone for listening. Eric, thanks for taking the time and encouraging us about our shared sent-ness. Let's call it sent-ness. I like calling it sent-ness because it's less confusing than saying our shared apostleship, even though I think he's actually implying that there.
Mm-hmm. Sent-ness.
Yeah, I like that word. We've made up a word today. All right.
Awesome. This was fun. Thanks so much, man.
Yeah, thank you. Have a great
Yeah.
night, brother.
Thanks.
Send me the video. Bye.